get started with this first story about Supreme Court guts affirmative action for higher education. Now, for those of you who are not aware, I have worked in higher ed for over 10 years. I've worked on admissions committees, so I have a lot to say about this particular subject. But I want to get started by diving in here. Supreme Court guts affirmative action, effectively ending race-conscious admissions. Let's dive in. In a historic decision, the U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday effectively ended race-conscious admission programs at colleges and universities across the country. In a decision divided along ideological lines, the six-justice conservative supermajority invalidated admissions programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Now, some of you may be wondering, why is UNC mentioned? UNC, I went to high school in North Carolina, so just FYI, UNC is a public university, but it is a high-ranked public university. It is not easy to get into UNC. So that's why they're there. Just keep that in mind. The decision reverses decades of precedent upheld over the years by a narrow Supreme Court majorities that include Republican-appointed justices. It ends the ability of colleges and universities, public and private, to do what most say they still need to do: consider race as one of many factors in deciding which of the qualified applicants is to be admitted. Chief Justice John Roberts, a lifetime critic of affirmative action programs, wrote the decision for the court majority, saying that the nation's colleges and universities must use colorblind criteria in admissions. Okie dokie. Let me say a little bit before I show you this video from Harvard. Universities. When I applied to college, might shock some of you. When I applied to college, I actually did not put my race on my college applications. And I did that on purpose. Because I wanted to see if they were just going to accept me for my merits and not because of my race. I got into every college I applied to. But that's besides the point in reference to this affirmative action decision. That doesn't happen for everyone. And having been a part of admission committees, I'm here to tell you that, yeah, it is a factor in admissions. But it's not done in the way that you would think. So let me explain to you how this worked. When I was on admission committees, I can't give individual examples because of privacy issues, but when I was on admission committees, the first thing that I had to do was sort the applications. Now, some of you are wondering, how do you go about sorting them? What do you think was the first sorting method that was used? Tell me in the chat. May not be what you think. Let's see what people say. Max's speech was called. Whoever says money. Pete says GPA. Bryce says race. Oh, it jumped ahead of me. Aaron said income. Leroy said race. Bingo. SAT. The first sorting method that I had to use were those standardized test scores, whether it was the SAT or the ACT. That was the first sorting method. So if your score fell below what was the recommended admission requirement, then whether you were black or white, I didn't look at your application. This is just the reality. This is something some of you are going to be mad at me, but I'm just telling you my experience. This is the reality that some people don't want to hear. Yes, if your SAT score, ACT score fell below a certain number, same thing for those of you who applied to grad school. If you took the GMAT, if you took the GRE, and you fell below a certain number, some of these universities didn't even look at your application. Sorry, just keeping it real. That's the first criteria that I had to use. The second one, and you guys already mentioned it here in the chat, was the GPA. I lost the person who, Raul, GPA. That was second. So we have standardized test scores, then we have GPA. After that, income. Someone said income. I'm going to change it a little bit. Not necessarily income, but where you went to school. Zip code. What high school did you go to? Is that high school highly ranked? These are all the things that are looked at, believe it or not. So what that tells you right then and there is that if you go to high school or you live in a zip code that is a poor district, working class district, and your school most likely is not ranked pretty high, you're already at a disadvantage. People don't want to hear this, but it's a reality. You're already at a disadvantage, right? So those things are looked at. Then there is also the race issue. Now, typically how this would work, if I had two applicants and I had a white guy and a black guy, and both of them had the same, let's say, SAT score, let's say they had the same GPA, both had 4.0 GPA, and I only have one spot, this is oftentimes where the race factor will come into play. That is when people will say, the admissions committee, all right, well, both of these applicants are great applicants, but we only have one spot left. And that is usually where we would go with the black applicant. That's how it works. When I did this for 10 years. And that's how it worked. The point that I'm trying to get across to you is the very first thing that we looked at were the merits. So this is why I continue to tell people, this is why I'm a strong advocate for getting rid of standardized tests to determine if people get into college. Because studies have shown just because you have a lower SAT score or is not as high as that university wants you to have, that doesn't mean that you are going to perform poorly in college. Now, there is some correlation that shows you have a high SAT score, you're probably going to do really well. But I'll be honest, I don't even remember what was on the SAT. I didn't even remember. By the time I started my freshman year, I didn't even remember what was on the SAT. So I've always pushed for that. More schools are starting to change rules around that, which I think is really good. But I became more strongly opposed to it because of my job. And it is really sad because you could have someone that has maybe a 3.2 GPA. They don't have a high standardized test score, but they have a list of extracurricular activities that they've done. Maybe they were, and we're not going to leave out sports for a second because there's a whole different component to people who are athletes. But they had extracurricular activities that they did. Let's say they were part of the Key Club or something like that, or they had a part-time job. Believe it or not, a lot of admission committees do not consider having a part-time job as an extracurricular activity. And that is a damn shame. It's one of the reasons why I left higher education. That's a shame. So what that means is that a lot of students that are coming from poor areas where maybe they have to have a part-time job to help out the parents, they're penalized because of it in reference to some college admission standards. And that's messed up. They really do not look at that as extracurricular. Now, Harvard University, they issued a response in reference to the Supreme Court affirmative action ruling. Now, this is kind of funny considering Harvard University itself discriminated against Asian students. Isn't this something? Listen to this.
I want to bring in NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton, who was at Harvard University. Of course, that is one of the schools involved directly in the cases at hand. And what are you hearing? Kind of reaction is happening there?
Well, Anna, the majority of the students that I've spoken to, and I've been in conversation with them for weeks leading up to this moment, they are reeling, they are devastated, and they're worried about what the culture, what the makeup of their classes, the future generations coming up behind them at Harvard, what they're going to look like in the future. You know, many of them have been dreading this moment for a long time now because it was clear from the very earliest stages of this lawsuit that it was going to wind its way up slowly to the Supreme Court and that this result was likely. So they've had time emotionally to prepare for it, but what I'm hearing is that it still feels like a gut punch for many of them. And their concerns are rooted in reality. You take a look at what happened in the California system, and what students point to is that you look at that system more than 2 decades ago, they did away with affirmative action, and then their elite colleges, part of the UC system, saw about a 50% drop in minority admissions. Keep in mind, these are public universities that all families, all communities in the state of California pay into, and then you saw this drastic reduction in access for minority families, not just Black families, but Latino families, and then here on Harvard's campus.
But why did that happen? Because of what I just explained to you, the sorting method. So again, when you look at the majority, like the standardized test scores, when you look at the data, African-American students, we don't perform as well on those tests. Now, obviously, that's not everybody who's African-American, but we don't perform as well overall when you look at the data. So if you're sorting the applications based on the standardized test first, of course, the admission, this is going to decrease. You see the problem? This is a big part of the problem. But Harvard University really got some kind of nerve because they lost the lawsuit that was filed against them that proved that they were purposely racially discriminating against Asian applicants. They were trying to decrease the number of Asian students that they admitted into the university. So it's just like, Harvard, really? Let's go on.
Just this spring, the upcoming class, the kids who found out this spring that they were going to be future Harvard students this coming fall, we saw a drop in admissions of Black, Latino, Native American, and Native Hawaiian students. And that is before this decision came out. And
that's because of the standardized test scores.
So these are the things that are fueling students' concerns right now. But when you talk to kids, it's conflicting, right? They want to imagine that these workarounds might still work. The reality is,
why were they doing that? Let me explain for those who are not aware. The reason why Harvard was doing that is because they were trying to increase admissions for students who are African American and students who are Latino. And again, the sorting method, they're looking at those standardized test scores. Like I told you, who usually performs the best on the standardized tests is usually white students and Asian students. So Harvard was trying to make it so that more Black students and more Latino students would become admitted into their school. And in order, they felt that the way to do that was to basically just racially discriminate against Asian Americans. And it wasn't even like, we're going to try to admit more Black students. It was more like just blatant, we're not admitting any more Asian students or these amount of Asian students. Like, it was blatant. That's why I read.
The UC system tried those workarounds as well, and they're still struggling every year to get minority enrollment back up. And what they're also seeing is not just that those students are being rejected, right, but also that actually lower numbers of minorities are even applying to those schools, even imagining themselves as being part of the campus. And so the concern is that it's going to be hard, right, to even quantify the impacts here. How do you measure people who would have applied to Harvard but now are afraid to, who would have imagined themselves at Columbia or Brown or UNC but are now going to be worried that their application isn't going to get a second look? Take a listen to a conversation that I had with one student here. She's actually a high schooler who is incredibly talented, likely going to be applying to colleges and universities like this one. And she kind of walked through some of her conflicting emotions. Take a listen.
I think that is a little bit conflicting, especially when you're like, I've worked so hard my whole life to get to this point, and I don't want my racial identity to stop me from, becoming who I want to be. But then it's on the flip side to that, I feel like some racial minorities or identities and groups of people have had harder experiences in America and are not given the same opportunities as other majority groups.
Let me come in here for a second because I don't want to lose this thought. I think the big question that we need to ask is, why are they making college so unattainable in the first place? I think a lot of people talking about this issue, they're not bringing up that point. Why is this happening, folks? I told you about the test scores. I told you about the GPA. And I told you about the racial decisions. But why is it happening? It's happening because they have found a way to make college unobtainable to a lot of people. That's the big issue, folks. That should not happen. Why do you have to have, and it's not just Harvard, even the public universities, why do you have to have like a 1600 on the SAT? Why do you have to have, oh, we're looking for students that only have a GPA of 3.0. Why do you have to have all that? Why? And so for those who will say, well, they're not going to perform well if they don't have the test scores and they don't have the GPA. Isn't that their choice as a student? Isn't it up to the applicant to decide whether or not they want to continue and try to do it anyway? Yes. So you admit them, you let them in, and they don't perform well. Okay. It's still their choice. You're not even giving them the opportunity to see if they can perform well. So then what is it really about? It's about statistics. It's about rankings, where these universities rank. That's based on GPA. That's based on test scores. And why does that matter? Because that also can affect funding. That also can affect donors. Donors are more willing to donate to these universities when they see that they are performing well. This is a big thing. I told you universities became a business. If they see that the performance starts to decline, they're less likely to donate again. And I actually experienced that myself with my former job, where one of the big donors did not like how people were performing, the students were performing, and they decided not to redonate. It all comes down to money. Exactly, Pete. But they should be given that opportunity. Now, I think Nico also hit this on the head. Listen to what Nico said in reference to the merits.
Or just reversing affirmative action policy in college admissions. And I just gotta say that basically everybody regarding this topic has no idea what the fuck they are talking about. There are some that are claiming that this fixes racism and there will be no more discrimination and everything will be merit-based. And there are others who are claiming that black people will never be able to succeed and minorities will never be able to succeed if this program doesn't exist. I'm here to tell you that you're both kind of right, but you're both super wrong. For the sake of time, we're going to do a very simplistic breakdown of Harvard's admissions, for example. Harvard rates every student 1 to 6 based on 6 categories: academic, extracurricular, athletic, school support, personal, and overall. If you get rated 1, that's the best, 6 is the worst. Race in this particular situation is partially accepted as a factor to be considered. And do you want to know why? Because economic race-based suppression still exists. Things like redlining still exist. And merit or a meritocracy is still affected by one's background. So
hold on to that piece there about the merits and the background. I'm going to address that in just a second.
maybe you're one of those kids who had to work most of high school so you couldn't do as many extracurricular activities. Now we know that extracurricular activities affect your ability to get in, so you should be hurt negatively because of the neighborhood you were born in due to redlining. Now I need you to understand that's just one small example. But my point is that people perceive merits differently. So for those of you who think that this is going to solve the merit problem, it's not. You can still be discriminated against. Maybe in this particular case, it isn't race that's the issue, It's what you are choosing to prioritize as being considered meritorious.
Nico hit the nail on the head. You'll just be discriminated against in another way. And that way is more likely to be class. When we talk about, I want to show you something here. This is very important. When we talk about Black admission to these universities, listen to this. Was affirmative action uplifting the Black poor? 85% of BAs awarded to Black students go to Black folks in the middle and upper classes. In any room where a BA is a prerequisite, the odds that the person next to you has come from Black poverty are low. This is the part that some people are going to be pissed off about, but this is true. I told you about the zip codes. I told you about the high school rankings. If you went to Belmont High School here in Belmont, Massachusetts, you have a lot easier shot of getting into Harvard University than someone who went to high school in Lynn, Massachusetts. Zip code matters. This is true. This is not to say, and this article talks about the failure of affirmative action. This is not to say that there are not Black students that went to, a university and came from a poor neighborhood. Yes, there are, but they're not the norm. And that's what people have to understand. Now, why is that? Like I told you again, go back to those test scores and sorting those applications. 2, when universities admit students that are coming from a working class neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, 9 times out of 10, those students are going to need a lot of funding so that they can attend the school. Besides financial aid, right? Besides student loans, they're going to need a scholarship. They're going to need grants. That costs the school money. The school's trying to make money. You see what I mean? So this is something that you got to think about. Again, it's a business. So if the business is paying more money than they're actually making, they're not making a profit. Most of the Black students that benefited from affirmative action in reference to higher education belong to the middle class or the upper middle class. Most of them are not poor. And people have to really understand that. So in reference to higher education, I'm not talking about affirmative action, across the board, just higher education. Poor Black people were not benefiting from it. This is a sad reality that some people don't want to admit. They don't want to talk about it. Nico, by the way, went to the University of North Carolina. He knows his stuff. Now, I want to bring up the example of someone like Colin. Colin said, when I was in high school, I was told the only reason I got into Boston College was because of affirmative action. If we can continue that students of color can get into any school without their race being a liability, then affirmative action wouldn't be necessary. F SCOTUS. So Colin, again, and again, Colin came from like that middle class background. Boston College, for those who are not aware, it's a traditionally Catholic university. There are not many Black students at Boston College. I'm just here to tell you that. You walk across the campus and you look around, like there are just not many. It's also a very expensive school. So keep that in mind as well. But that's, when Colin says that, now with the ruling that they have today, the question is, would Colin get in now? That is something to think about. And this is also something to think about, because when the Supreme Court made that decision, it applied to universities, but it did not apply to military academies. Military academies exempt from Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling. Shout out to Lucy, by the way, from Indie News Network. She tweeted this out. Let me tell you why. I don't even have to read the article, damn it. Let me tell you why. Okay? You know why it doesn't apply to the military academies? Because military recruitment is down. They want you to go to the military academies. They want you, when you go to the military academies, afterwards you join the military full time. They want you in the military. They just don't care to have you in the classroom, particularly if you're poor. Where do the recruiters go a lot of times? They go to poor, black and brown neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, and they recruit at those high schools because those kids look around and they're like, well, something's got to be better than what I'm doing right now. So, of course, you can still use affirmative action for the military academies. And then they have people out there doing their bidding. AOC hosting these military recruitment events at schools in the Bronx. There are other things for kids in the Bronx to do besides joining the military. And they got the so-called progressive politician out there doing it for them with a smile. Now, like I said, some people, they're not going to like what I said, but remember, I have the experience. I was on admissions committees. But the rule of thumb, what we need to take from this entire discussion is the fact that this country has made college unobtainable for a lot of people. That is the problem. And I think that college should be more obtainable for people. If they don't do well in college, again, that should be their decision. And fuck the rankings, by the way. Get rid of that shit. I never understood that. Like, oh, well, such and such school is ranked number 10 or number 8. So what? Who cares? Get rid of the rankings. Get rid of it. I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, 2008 B. Scott. Here is another thing people don't tell you. Feeder schools to highly selective privates and publics that are supposedly rigorous tend to have more grade inflation because they know GPA matters. There you go. Curving grades, for those who are not aware. Like some teachers, I had some professors that would do this. They would grade on a curve. So if you made like a 85 on an exam, they may curve it to like a 90. There's that too. Thank you for the super chat, Marcos. I am going to tag you on a tweet. All righty. I'll look to that. Simone says GPA does not equate to IQ. I agree. Greg Bruce says Baraka wins fatality. Interesting. Okay. And thank you, M. Smith. Standardized tests aren't everything. My SAT score was bad and I graduated from college. 0.04 short of graduating with honors. Worked full-time throughout. There you go. Standardized tests is just another way to eliminate applicants, basically. It's like, let's cut this application stack in half. Puts limitations. It's a mess.